Meccano part number 217A, flat disc, from the 1930s. Hi folks and welcome back. This is the seventh of the aeroplane constructor set builds, the low wing cabin monoplane. And following on from the commercial low wing monoplane, it very much seemed like the same model, to be honest. But the prototypes were a decade apart. As always, the instructions give you a couple of examples of existing aircraft to research and find out about. In this case, the Hendy 302 and the Percival Gull. And, sitting at my desk reading research material to write this script, the sky is of the purest blue, with white clouds sailing slowly and majestically, framed by the oak, ash and giant lime tree. It looks like a magical country, with valleys and high mountains. While we are tied to the earth, mere mortals, to only imagine what it must be like, engine thundering, to hurtle through those glens, to explore that unknown, uncharted country. And in today's world of mass air transport, have we lost some of the romance of the beginning of flight? As there are no firsts left, everything has been done. What more can we aim to achieve apart from faster? But there was a time when there were records to take and to hold, achievements that you were the first to achieve. And they were held by the rock stars of their time, heroes whose names stood tall as their feats were discussed in the major newspapers of the period. Names like Jean Batten and Philip Sassoon. Names you probably never heard of, but not 100 years ago, they were the heroes of legend. While this build was very similar to the low-wing commercial monoplane, it is what the aircraft was designed to do that is the difference. Cabin monoplane is more like the family car, where the commercial plane is more like your public transport bus. And as with so many of these builds, you were given examples of prototypes, many of which never made it past the first 5 airframes. The Hendy 302 was one such airframe, designed by Basil B. Henderson, whose name was given to the airframe, and built by the Hendy Aircraft Company in 1929. Basil Hendy Henderson had worked for A.V. Rowe and Co. Limited from 1924 to 1928 on their technical staff, and when Avro closed their Hamble works, he redesigned and set up his own company with Horace Albert Miles. The Hendy 302 went on to fly in the King's Cup Air Race, flown by Edgar Percival, the noted Australian aircraft designer. Mr. Percival, living at that point in Britain, went on to design the Percival Gull from his experiences with the Hendy 302, with the first Gull taken to the air in 1932. Built by the Parnell Aircraft Company, the then owners of the Hendy Aircraft Company, I wonder if their chief designer, Basil B. Henderson, looked at the Gulls being built and, knowing of its origin, got some satisfaction that his airframe still flew on in the shape of the Gull. A total of 48 were built, many going on to break world records and achieve world firsts. The Gull went on to see the development of the Vega Gull, of which 90 were built, and the Mew Gull, a racing variant of which 5 were built. The Mew Gull won the King's Cup Air Race 3 times between 1937 and 1955, and the Vega Gull once. And considering that the race was only held 9 times during that period, that's not a bad record. The King's Cup was a brainchild of King George V in the early 1920s. The purpose behind the Cup was to promote light aircraft and engine design and development. The Cup was open to any person born in the Commonwealth, regardless of gender. The first race was held on the 9th of September 1922 and was won by Captain Franklin L. Barnard. The chief pilot for Instone Airline, flying mail between Cardiff, Hounslow and Paris in an Airco DH-4, the same aircraft he used to win the Cup. He raced again in 1923, but the Cup went to Frank Courtney, again in 1924, but not winning. In 1925 saw him take his second Cup title, flying an Armstrong Whitworth Siskin, a frontline RAF fighter aircraft at the time. In 1926 he had to retire flying the prototype Bristol 99 Badminton aircraft due to a fuel feed problem. The aircraft was rebuilt in 1927 as the Type 99A, and Captain Barnard re-entered for the Cup for his sixth time. And on the 28th of August 1927, a few days before the race, while testing the aircraft, the engine failed at 200 feet. Attempting to glide the badminton back to ground, it stalled at 80 feet, crashing into the ground, killing Captain Barnard. 3 years later, in 1930, we see Winifred Brown take part in the Cup. She was a bit of a rebel, getting expelled from school at age 14 after writing graffiti on the toilet wall, which included the head teacher. She started flying in 1927 at the Lancaster Aero Club and was the first female pilot of the club. From the get-go, social restraints of the time forbade her from entering events that were defined as being all male only. And in 1929, she attended the King's Cup for the first time as a spectator. In 1930, she decided to enter, flying an Avro Avon, which her father had bought for her for £500, as she was wanting to compete against the men. The Lancashire Aero Club principals were against her taking part, as they were worried that her result would look bad for the club. The route for that year was to start at Hanworth, then out to Hamble, Whitechurch in Bristol, Birmingham, Houghton Park, Barton Aerodrome, Woodford Aerodrome, Sherburn in Elmet, then to Cramlington just north of Newcastle upon Tyne, then Hendon Aerodrome, Ratcliffe Aerodrome, and then back to Hanworth. Arriving at the London Air Park in Hanworth with her boyfriend, she was denied a room at the local Aero Club, where the social pre-race event was taking part that evening. There were 101 entries that year, and she was flying against the best. Up against the Schneider Trophy winner and the 1929 King's Cup winner, Richard Waghorn. Augustus Orlibar, the world's fastest person in the air at that time, having broken the world's airspeed record in the Supermarine S6. Geoffrey de Havilland and his son Geoffrey Jr. Lady Mary Bailey and Winifred Spooner. Edgar Percival, Frederick Guest, and William Francis Forbes Sempill, known as the Master of Sempill. She was flying in a class of pilots that would be the same as me taking part in a Formula One race. On takeoff, only 88 of the 101 aircraft lifted off the ground. By Whitechurch, she was told that she was already climbing the leaderboard, having passed several other contenders. Refuelling at Barton, her father told her she was in third position. But the weather was worsening, and Yorkshire is no place for faint-hearted people to want to fly in. Not in that period. She had to cross the Pennines to get to Cramlington, and she chose Woodhead Pass, renowned for its bad weather. A bleak place, far from help when it goes wrong. Landing at Cramlington, she was informed that she was in the lead. And on touching down at Hanworth, she had a 10-minute wait until the next aircraft arrived. She had flown the 753-mile route in 11 hours 15 minutes, with 4 refuelling stops at an average speed of 100 miles an hour. She was the first woman to win the Cup. Against all the odds, unlike a number of women at the time, she was fighting to just be seen for her skill in a society that was still shocked that women drove cars. 2 of the Percival Gull aircraft designed by Edgar Percival are linked to some of the most amazing record-breaking events carried out in the 1930s, piloted by Jean Batten. Miss Batten, who'd been born in New Zealand, learnt to fly in 1930 in England, under the pretence of attending the Royal College of Music, when in fact she was learning to fly. Enthralled by Amy Johnson, the first woman to fly solo to Australia from England in 1930, Miss Batten vowed to beat her. It took 3 attempts, 2 failed ones. And then in 1934, flying a Gypsy Moth biplane, she made the flight in 15 days. Then she flew back to Britain, claiming the bag of being the first woman to do so. While to us now, this might seem unimpressive, the Gypsy Moth she flew only had a range of 800 miles, no GPS, no radio for if it goes wrong, and it had on both of her previous attempts, let alone flying in countries that hadn't seen an aircraft, let alone the idea of a woman flying one. Her next sight was on the England to Brazil title in 1935. To do that, she purchased a Percival Gull 6 at a cost of £1,750. She had additional fuel tanks installed, giving her a range of 2,000 miles over the standard 700 that the aircraft had normally. Her route from Lymph Aerodrome was to Casablanca, then on to Dakar, out to Villa Cisneros, then out across the South Atlantic to Brazil, landing at Port Natal. While the flight was challenging, she completed it in 2 days, 13 hours and 15 minutes, breaking all the speed records previously set, even the ones by the 4-engined French mail planes that flew the route regularly. Her next target was the England to New Zealand bag, but she also wanted to beat the men's record to Australia that stood at 6 days, 21 hours, set by Jimmy Broadbent the year before. She did it in 5 days, 21 hours. And, with still 3,700 miles to fly to New Zealand, Batten ran into the first real problem that would stop her flight dead: the official powers at be. In her own words, she put it down to sexism. And while it is a word we hear a lot now, I can well believe it at that time. Australia was a man's country, one of the last real frontiers left in the world still. She was eventually allowed to complete the flight. All told, the journey had taken 11 days, 45 minutes, and the record would stand for 44 years until it was broken. To put the icing on the cake, she returned to England. Against a lot of negative opinions in New Zealand and Australia, she completed it in 5 days, 19 hours and 15 minutes. She became the first woman to win both the inbound and outbound fastest flights solo. Broadbent congratulated her on her achievements. He had tried to retake the record from her, but ran out of fuel in Iraq. He retook the fastest outbound flight in 1936. But to sum up the feeling at the time in Britain, one newspaper ran with the headline, "The girl who has beaten all the men."